pick up! We need that monitor on now. Come on, please answer me!
The night I almost died on a hospital bed, my husband was 3 streets away, lying in another woman's arms, and his phone was on silent. I called him 11 times. 11 times the phone rang and rang into nothing, while a nurse pressed her palm against my stomach and told me to breathe through the pain, that help was coming, that I should stay calm. I was not calm. I was terrified. And somewhere underneath the terror, something in me had already started to understand a truth I was not ready to face, that the man I had built my life around had, without ever saying it out loud, already left me. Before I tell you how that night ended and what I found out afterward that turned my whole marriage inside out, let me ask you to sit with me for a while. If you have ever loved someone who made you feel invisible in the exact moment you needed to be seen, you already know how this story begins. Stay to the end, because nothing about this is what it first looks like. And if stories like mine mean something to you, you may want to subscribe before we go further, so you don't miss where this one goes. My name doesn't matter as much as what happened to me, but you can call me Bisade. I was 34 years old the night everything changed, and up until then, I would have told you my marriage was ordinary. Not perfect, ordinary. The kind of marriage where you stop noticing the small silences because you've convinced yourself silence is just what long marriages sound like. I met my husband, Kunle, 9 years before that night at a wedding in Ibadan where I knew almost no one. He was the groom's cousin, tall, easy with his laughter, the kind of man who made a room feel less like a room. I was the shy one standing near the food table, and he came and stood beside me and said something about the jollof rice being an insult to every woman's mother in the room, and I laughed before I meant to. That was Kunle. He had a way of getting past your guard before you noticed your guard was down. Those 2 years of courtship were the happiest of my life, and I say that now without bitterness, only clarity. Because I think it is important to tell you that this was not a man who was cold from the beginning, not a man whose falseness was obvious if only I had looked harder. He drove 3 hours on weekends just to sit with me while I graded exam scripts, content to watch television with the sound low so I could concentrate. He learned without being asked that I liked my amala a certain way, slightly firmer than most people preferred, and he would tease the buka woman near his office into making it exactly so before bringing it to my flat, still warm, wrapped in newspaper. When my father died suddenly in our second year of courtship, Kunle was the one who organized the burial logistics with my uncles, who sat beside me through every awkward, grief-heavy family meeting, who held my hand at the graveside while I could not stop shaking. I fell in love with a version of him that I still believe, to this day, was real. That is perhaps the cruelest part of what I would later learn, that a man can be genuinely good to you and still, over time, choose to become someone else. We married 2 years later, in a small but joyful ceremony in my hometown, my mother weeping through pride through the entire engagement list presentation, my aunties ululating so loudly the compound dogs 3 houses down started barking in response. His mother, Iya Kunle, everyone called her that, even I did, for years, before I understood what that name would come to mean to me. She was polite at our wedding, the kind of polite that keeps its true face folded away for later. She wore a beautiful blue and gold ashoke, danced enthusiastically during the money spring, and pulled me aside afterward to tell me, in a voice thick with what I mistook for emotion, "Take care of my son, he is all I have." I did not think much of it then. Mothers are protective of their sons, I told myself. That was all it was. A mother's ordinary tenderness, nothing more sinister folded inside it. It would be years before I understood that the sentence had not been a blessing at all, but a quiet claim, staked in front of witnesses, over territory she had never intended to fully surrender to me. For the first few years, we were happy in the plain, unremarkable way that happy people rarely think to be grateful for. Kunle worked in logistics, moving up steadily in a freight company, and I taught secondary school English while running a small event decoration business on weekends, balloons, ashoebi coordination, small parties for people who wanted their child's naming ceremony to look like something out of a magazine. We were not rich. We were building. I believed we were building it together. The first real crack, if I'm honest with you, came in our 4th year when I lost a pregnancy at 14 weeks. I had already begun telling my close friends, already begun quietly imagining names, already begun the private habit of resting my palm on my still flat stomach when no one was watching. The bleeding started on a Tuesday morning while I was preparing for school, and by the time I reached the hospital, there was nothing left to save. I do not like to dwell on it, but I tell you because it matters to what came later. Kunle held me that night. He cried too, quietly, like the way men who were raised to believe grief is weakness cry, like they're ashamed of their own grief, wiping his face quickly whenever he thought I wasn't looking, as though grief itself were a debt he did not want to be seen owing. For a few months after that, he was tender with me in a way that frightened me a little, because it felt like pity more than love. He brought me suya I hadn't asked for. He rubbed my feet in the evenings without being prompted. He told me more than once, unprompted, "We will try again when you're ready. There's no rush." And at the time I had only kindness in it. I did not yet know how to hear the second meaning folded underneath, that somewhere in him a clock had started, quietly, that had nothing to do with my healing and everything to do with his mother's expectations, ticking down towards a patience he had not told me was already limited.
And then slowly, over the better part of a year, the tenderness thinned out, and what replaced it was distance. Not cruelty, just distance. He started staying later at work, first by 30 minutes, then an hour, then 2. Each new lateness arriving so gradually that I never had a single moment sharp enough to object to. He started taking calls in the bathroom, the shower running to cover his voice, though I did not let myself think about why a phone call needed running water as a curtain. When I asked, lightly, half joking, who he was hiding from in there, he would laugh it off. Work wahala, you don't want to hear it. And I, wanting badly to believe him, chose not to want to hear it either. Iya Kunle began visiting more often around that time too. She would arrive unannounced on weekday afternoons, sit in my parlor, sipping the zobo I made for her, extra ginger the way she liked it, because even then I was still trying to be a good daughter-in-law, still trying to earn a warmth I did not yet realize would never fully be given. And she would ask questions that were not really questions. Is it true a woman's body changes after such a thing happens? Is it true some women cannot carry again after losing one so early? She would ask these things with her head tilted in an expression of soft concern, the kind that looks from the outside exactly like love. I would answer as gently as I could, explaining what the doctors had told me, that there was no medical reason I could not carry a healthy pregnancy to term in the future, and she would nod slowly, murmuring, "Ah, thank God," in a tone that never quite reached her eyes. I did not understand yet that I was being assessed, the way a buyer assesses goods at a market before deciding to commit to the price. I thought I was being comforted. There were other visits too, ones I only understood the shape of much later. She would ask, almost idly, about my family, how my mother was managing since my father's death, whether my younger siblings were settled, whether there was any history of difficulty carrying children on my mother's side. At the time, these felt like the ordinary nosiness of an older woman with nothing else to occupy her afternoons. Looking back, I recognize them now as reconnaissance, a woman quietly building a case file on the wife she had never chosen, gathering whatever small vulnerabilities she could find, filing them away for a day she was already patiently preparing for. By our 6th year of marriage, there was a new name that had started appearing at the edges of our life, Morounkeji. Kunle called her Moro, casually, the way you'd refer to any colleague. Moro handled the shipment. Moro's flight got delayed. Moro said the client in Port Harcourt is difficult. The name arrived so gradually into our household vocabulary that I could not, even now, tell you the exact day I heard it. That is how these things work, I have come to learn. Betrayal rarely announces itself. It slips in disguised as a co-worker's name mentioned in passing over dinner, until one day you realize the name has been said so many times, it no longer even registers as unusual. I met her once in person at a company dinner Kunle's firm held for spouses, a glittering, slightly overdone affair at a hotel in Victoria Island with too much jollof and too many long speeches from executives who clearly enjoyed the sound of their own voices. Kunle had introduced me around the room all evening, his hand at the small of my back, playing the proud husband so convincingly that even now, remembering it, I find myself briefly doubting my own later discoveries, the way you doubt your own eyes when a magician's trick is good enough. Then we reached her. She was beautiful in the effortless way that makes other women instinctively straighten their backs. Tall, warm-skinned, wearing a simple black dress that somehow outshone every heavily embellished aswebi in the room, with a laugh that carried across the space and made people turn toward it like sunflowers turning toward light. Kunle's voice changed very slightly when he introduced her. I noticed it even then, though I filed it under nothing, the way you file so many things. A small brightness, a small quickening, the tone men use when they are trying very hard to sound casual about something that is not casual to them at all. This is Moro. She's on my team, handles a lot of our Port Harcourt accounts. She held my hand a bit too long when we were introduced, her grip firm, her eyes moving over my face with an attention that felt less like friendliness and more like study, and said, "So this is the wife," in a tone I could not quite place at the time, something almost rehearsed in it, something that did not match the casualness of a first meeting, but that I would replay in my head over and over months later once I understood what it meant. She had not been meeting me that night. She had simply, finally, been permitted to see in the flesh the obstacle she had spent years hearing about from the two people who were lying to her about how permanent that obstacle really was. I want to pause here and be honest with you, the way I wasn't honest with myself back then. There were signs. There are always signs. A wife who tells you she never suspected anything is often a wife who chose, for her own survival, not to look directly at what she already half knew. I noticed the late nights. I noticed the phone that had started sleeping face down on his side of the bed, a habit he never had before. I noticed that when I asked about his day, his answers had gotten shorter, flatter, like a man reciting a report, rather than sharing his life with the person who was supposed to know all of it. I noticed, and then I told myself I was being paranoid, because the alternative was too heavy to carry, while also grading exam scripts and hot glowing balloon arches and trying to get pregnant again on a doctor's calendar that never seemed to align with either of our moods. Around that same period, small domestic details began shifting in ways I could not name at the time, but that my body seemed to register before my mind would let me. Kunle started buying his own boxers and undershirts, instead of leaving it to, as he always had, to me. He started ironing his own shirts on the night he came home late, when previously I had always laid his clothes out for the next morning, as a small act of care neither of us ever discussed, simply did. He began keeping a gym bag by the door that he never seemed to actually use for the gym. And once, half joking, I asked if I could throw his sweaty gym clothes in with the regular wash. He snapped at me with a sharpness that startled us both. "Just leave it, I'll handle my own bag." I remember standing in the kitchen afterwards, stung, telling myself he was simply stressed from work. I did not yet let myself ask why a man suddenly stressed from work needed to guard a gym bag like it contained something more dangerous than sweat-soaked t-shirts. It was in the 7th year that the pain started. Not the emotional kind, though there was plenty of that too, but a real physical pain, low in my abdomen, that came and went like a warning I kept ignoring. I told myself it was stress. I told myself it was the stress of trying month after month and failing month after month to carry another child. I did not go to the hospital when I should have. I am telling you this so that when I describe what happened on that night, you understand it was not sudden. My body had been trying to tell me something for weeks, and I had been too busy holding my marriage together with both hands to listen to it. The night it finally broke me was a Friday. Kunle told me that morning he had a work trip, an inspection at one of the company's depots in Sagamu, an overnight thing, back by Saturday evening. I did not think anything of it. Work trips were normal for him. I made him akara and pap before he left because even on a morning like that, I was still a woman trying to be a good wife, still trying to earn something I did not yet know I had already lost. By afternoon, the pain in my stomach had become something else entirely. It started as a dull ache low on my right side, the kind I had been quietly living with for weeks and had learned to breathe through while marking exam scripts or supervising a NIMI ceremony setup. But by 2 o'clock, it had sharpened into something that made me grip the edge of the kitchen counter and breathe through my teeth, sweat breaking out along my hairline, even though the ceiling fan was on full speed. I sat on the cold kitchen tiles for almost 20 minutes because standing had become impossible, my forehead pressed against the cabinet door, counting my own breaths the way a nurse had once taught me during a hospital first aid seminar at school, in through the nose for 4 counts, out through the mouth for 6. I called my younger sister Yetunde, and she could hear it in my voice before I even finished the sentence. Bisade, that doesn't sound normal. You need to go to the hospital now, not tomorrow, now, she said. Already, I later learned, pulling her car keys off the hook as she spoke. I brushed her off at first, the way women who have spent years minimizing their own pain always do, telling her I would rest a little and see how I felt by evening, telling her Kunle would be back from Sagamu the next day, and I didn't want to alarm anyone over what was probably just cramps. By 7 that evening, I could no longer stand upright without both hands braced against the wall, and even sitting had become its own kind of agony, a deep, twisting pressure that made me nauseous every time I shifted position. I called a taxi myself because Kunle was not answering, and I told myself, even as I dialed him a second and third time before the car arrived, that he was probably in a meeting or the network in Sagamu was bad, and I would tell him everything once I got checked out, and he would rush back to meet me, full of apology and worry, the way a husband should. The taxi ride to the hospital is one of those stretches of time I remember only in fragments. The driver asking twice if I was okay, the street lights blurring past the window as another wave of pain rolled through me and I beat down hard on my own knuckle to keep from crying out, the particular useless comfort of pressing my cheek against the cool glass of the window and thinking absurdly in the middle of all that pain that I hoped I wasn't going to ruin the taxi's seat cover. I called him from the taxi. No answer. I called him from the hospital reception, doubled over a plastic chair while a nurse took my details, my voice shaking so much the receptionist had to lean in twice to find my date of birth. No answer. I called him while they wheeled me in for an ultrasound, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone to my ear, the technician's voice growing quieter and more clipped the longer she pressed the wand against my abdomen, which I now understand, looking back, was the sound of a professional trying to not alarm a patient while finding something seriously wrong. Between calls, I sent messages too, the kind you send when you are too afraid to say the words out loud a 7th time. Kunle, please, call me. I'm at the hospital. Kunle, it's serious, please. Kunle, where are you? Each message showed a single gray tick for what felt like an eternity, refusing to turn blue, refusing to confirm he had even seen them, let alone chosen not to respond. I did not know yet that a phone can be silenced deliberately, set face down on a bedside table in someone else's bedroom, its owner too absorbed in another woman's company to notice or care that it was buzzing itself into stillness against the wood. If you are the kind of person who has ever needed someone and watched the call ring out into nothing again and again, you know that particular kind of loneliness. It is not the same as being alone. It is being surrounded by strangers, doing their best to save you, while the one person who is supposed to be your person is unreachable, and you don't yet know why.
I remember the exact moment the doctor's expression shifted from routine concern to something more urgent, the way she suddenly stopped explaining things to me in a slow, reassuring voice and started speaking in short, efficient sentences to the nurse beside her instead. That shift is its own kind of terror, the terror of watching the professionals in the room stop performing calm for your benefit because there is no longer time for performance. The diagnosis when it came was an ovarian cyst that had ruptured and was bleeding internally. Emergency surgery. The doctor, a calm, no-nonsense woman named Dr. Fashina, asked me if there was a next of kin she should call because I would need someone to sign consent forms and be present for post-op. I gave her Kunle's number. I gave her my sister's number as backup, already sensing in some quiet corner of myself that the first number would not be answered. It was Yetunde who came. She arrived at the hospital in under 40 minutes, still in the clothes she was wearing for a church program, and she held my hand and signed what needed signing and sat outside the operating theater for 3 hours, praying in a whisper I could hear through the anesthesia haze, because that is the kind of sister she is. It was Yetunde, not my husband, who was there when I opened my eyes. Kunle called back at 11:47 that night. I know the exact time because I stared at my phone screen for a long time afterwards, the number burning itself into my memory. By then, I was out of surgery, groggy, my abdomen wrapped and aching, my sister asleep in the chair beside me with her head at an uncomfortable angle. I did not answer. I let it ring out, the way he had let mine ring out, 11 times, while I was being wheeled through a hospital corridor, not knowing if I would wake up whole. Kunle called again in the morning. This time I answered because I needed to know, more than I needed to be angry, where he had actually been. His voice was warm, easy, unbothered, the voice of a man who did not yet know his world was about to tilt. Baby, good morning. Oh, sorry I didn't see your calls. Network was terrible in Sagamu. This depot is in the middle of nowhere. He laughed a little, the laugh I used to love. I told him where I was. I told him what had happened. I told him in a voice that surprised me with how flat and controlled it stayed, that I had almost died, that a cyst had burst inside me and I had bled internally, that a stranger of a doctor asked me who my next of kin was because my husband could not be reached, that my sister had signed the papers because his phone had rung out 11 times. There was a silence on the line, a long one. And in that silence, something in his voice changed when he finally spoke again. A stumble, a catch, the sound of a man recalculating a lie in real time. Sagamo network is really bad, I told you, he said. But the warmth had gone out of it. It had become defensive, brittle. I'm coming now. I'm coming to the hospital now. He arrived 4 hours. 4 hours for a drive that should have taken 90 minutes if he had truly been coming from Sagamo. I noticed that. I filed it away, the way I had been filing away small wrong things for months. Except this time, I promised myself I would stop pretending not to notice. He came into the ward, looking freshly showered, wearing a shirt I did not recognize, smelling faintly of a cologne that was not his. I want you to sit with that detail for a second, because it is the kind of detail a wife notices even through morphine, even through grief, even through the particular exhaustion of having just survived surgery she went through completely alone. A cologne that was not his. He held my hand. He apologized. He blamed the network, the depot, the long drive, the stress of his job. He was so fluent in his own innocence that for a terrible, humiliating moment, I almost believed him over the evidence of my own senses. That is what a good liar does to you. He makes you distrust the very instincts that are protecting you. I did not confront him that day. I was too weak, too raw, too afraid of what confrontation might cost me, while I was still tethered to a hospital bed and dependent, in the most basic physical sense, on people around me being kind. But something had shifted permanently. I had spent 9 years married to a man I trusted by default, the way you trust gravity, without examining it. Now I was watching him the way you watch a stranger, carefully, for tells. The tells came fast once I started looking. The days immediately after discharge were quiet in a way that felt unnatural. The particular quiet of a house where one person is pretending everything is fine and the other person is too exhausted physically to do anything but let the pretense continue for a little while longer. Kunle brought me tea in the mornings. He plunked my pillows. He was on the surface, the picture of a devoted husband tending to his convalescing wife. And there were moments, God forgive me, when I let myself lean into that picture, when I told myself the Sagamo story could still be true, that bad network was a real and ordinary thing, that I was perhaps letting one bad night poison 9 good years. But my body remembers what the mind tries to forgive, and mine kept sending me small, insistent signals that something remained unresolved. I noticed he had started showering as soon as he walked in from work, before even greeting me properly, a habit that had never existed in our marriage before that year. I noticed his phone, which had always simply lived on the side table or the arm of the sofa, now traveled with him even to the kitchen, even to the balcony where he went to get some air. Small things, the kind of things a woman convinces herself she is imagining, until she stops convincing herself and starts writing them down instead. 3 days after I was discharged, still moving slowly, still tender along my incision, I found a receipt in the trouser pocket of the shirt he'd worn the day he came to the hospital, the shirt I did not recognize. It was a receipt from a lounge in Ikeja. On Friday night I was in surgery, time-stamped 9:40 p.m. 2 drinks, a shared plate of suya, not the receipt of a man alone in a depot in Sagamo, battling bad network. I did not confront him with it immediately. Instead, I started doing something I am not proud of and also not ashamed of. I started keeping a small notebook, the way you'd keep evidence for a case you were quietly building, because some part of me already understood that I would need proof, not just suspicion, if I was ever going to get the truth out of him. Within 2 weeks, my notebook had more than a receipt. It had a pattern of late meetings that never showed up on the shared calendar his office used, one I still had access to from when I used to help him format his quarterly reports, back in when we still shared passwords, the way people who trust each other completely do, without even discussing it. It had a new habit of him stepping outside to take calls, phone pressed tight to his ear, voice dropped low, always finding some errand. The generator needed checking. He wanted to see if the gateman had locked the back gate that conveniently placed him just out of earshot. Small things, the kind of things a woman convinces herself she's imagining until she stops convincing herself and starts writing them down instead. It had, too, a growing list of small financial inconsistencies I had started noticing once I began quietly paying closer attention to things I had once left entirely in his hands. A transfer here, a withdrawal there, amount too specific and too regular to be random, recurring, almost like rent. I did not understand what I was looking at. I only understood that the shape of it did not match a man occasionally straying. It matched a man maintaining something. I did not confront him with any of this yet. I told myself I needed to be sure, needed the picture to be complete, before I gave him the chance to talk his way around a partial truth, the way I had watched him talk his way around partial truths my whole married life. What I did not yet know was how large the picture actually was, and how much of it stretched back further than either the receipt or the perfume could explain. I want to remind you here, gently, that this story is not as simple as it looks. A husband who cheats on a sick wife is a story you have perhaps heard before in one shape or another. But stay with me, because what I found underneath the affair was not what I expected, and it changes everything about who the real villain of this story is. If you're the kind of person who likes a story that keeps twisting until the very end, this is a good moment to subscribe, because what comes next is the part that broke something open in me that I am still, even now, learning how to put back together. The woman's perfume led me to her name faster than I expected.
I am not a naturally suspicious person, but grief and betrayal make quick students of all of us. It took one afternoon of quiet, careful searching through Kunle's laptop, which he had left logged in the careless way men do when they've never had to hide anything from a wife who never looked, to find her. Morounkeji, Moro, the same woman from the company dinner, the one who had held my hand a bit too long and called me the wife in a tone I now understood perfectly. I remember my hands shaking as I opened the messaging app he had left minimized in the corner of the screen, half expecting the whole search to end in nothing, in some innocent explanation my mind could still cling to. Instead, the messages went back years, not weeks, not months, years. Long, easy conversations full of the kind of intimacy that develops slowly between two people who see each other constantly and comfortably. There were inside jokes I did not understand. There were photographs of meals I had never seen him eat, at restaurants I did not know he frequented. There was a running thread of affection so casual, so worn in that it read less like an affair in its exciting, secretive early stages and more like a second marriage that had been quietly operating alongside my own for longer than I wanted to calculate. I scrolled for almost 2 hours, my surgical scar aching from how long I sat hunched over that screen, unable to stop even as each new discovery made the ground beneath me feel less and less solid. But it was not just an affair. That would have been simple in its own devastating way. What I found in his messages, in the folder he thought was buried deep enough, was a second life, an apartment in Magodo, rented in his name that I had never known existed, paid for out of an account I had never seen on our joint statements. Photographs of Moro in that apartment, comfortable, at home, the way a woman is at home in a place she has lived in for a long time, not a place she visits in secret. A photograph dated 8 months earlier of Moro standing in front of that same apartment with a small, unmistakable curve at her stomach and a message beneath it from Kunle that read simply, "Our little secret is getting harder to hide, my love." I sat on the floor of our bedroom for a long time after I found that photograph, longer than I want to admit, because it was not just an affair I was looking at. It was a second family, a child or the promise of one growing in another woman's body, while I had spent the last 3 years quietly grieving the children I could not seem to carry to term, while my own husband held my hand in hospital wards and told me to keep believing, keep praying, keep trying. He had already stopped trying with me. He had simply never told me the truth. I did not confront him that night either. I know that might surprise you, that I sat on evidence like that and said nothing, that I closed his laptop, wiped my face, and made dinner as though my whole understanding of my marriage had not just been rearranged in a single afternoon. But I needed to understand the shape of what I was dealing with before I stepped into it. Because a man capable of this kind of deception for this long was not a man who would crumble at the first accusation. I had watched him talk his way around the receipt, around the 4-hour drive from Sagamo, around the cologne that wasn't his, and each time his fluency almost outpaced my certainty. I needed to know everything, every last thread of it, before I gave him the chance to control the narrative of what I knew, because men like Kunle do not confess to the full truth. They confess only to whatever portion of the truth you can already prove, and then perform contrition for that portion alone, hoping you will mistake a partial confession for total honesty. So instead of confronting him, I watched. I watched him kiss my forehead before leaving for work the next morning, apparently untroubled, apparently certain his secret remained exactly as it had always been. I watched him laugh at something on his phone during dinner and turn the screen away from me with the same practiced casualness he must have perfected over years of practice. And underneath my own calm, rehearsed face, I felt something harden in me that had never been there before. Not just hurt, but a kind of cold, methodical resolve. If this man spent years building a case for his deception, I decided I would spend whatever time it took building an airtight case for the truth. If you've made it this far with me, Thank you for staying, because the story is about to take a turn I did not see coming either, and I think you'll want to be here for it. So go ahead and subscribe now, quietly, the way I was quietly gathering my own evidence, and let's keep going together. It was my sister Yetunde who convinced me to go and see Morun myself, not to fight, but to understand. You cannot make a decision about your whole life based on half a story. Go and see her, not as an enemy, as a woman who deserves to know the truth as much as you do. I did not agree at first. The idea of standing in front of the woman my husband had built a second home with felt like a humiliation I could not survive. But something in me needed to look her in the eye, the way you need to see a wound directly before you can decide how to treat it. I found the apartment in Magudo on a Tuesday afternoon, when I knew that from the messages I had read, Kunle would be at work. I sat outside in a hired car for nearly 10 minutes before I found the courage to get out, watching the building's gate, rehearsing and abandoning a dozen different opening lines, none of which felt adequate to the moment I was about to walk into. When I finally did climb the stairs to the second floor, my legs felt like they belonged to someone else entirely. Moro opened the door herself, and for a moment neither of us said anything. She was visibly pregnant now, farther along than the photograph had shown, one hand resting on the swell of her stomach in the instinctive way pregnant women do, the other still gripping the door handle as though deciding whether to close it again. She did not look surprised to see me. She looked, if anything, tired, in a way that had nothing to do with the pregnancy, the specific tiredness of someone who has been quietly bracing for a reckoning for a long time and finds when it finally arrives that there is almost a strange relief in it. "I knew this day would come," she said, before I could speak. "Come in. You should hear this from me, not from him." She led me inside and sat me down on a cream-colored sofa that felt absurdly more comfortable than the one in my own parlor, and brought me a glass of water with hands that trembled almost as much as mine. The apartment was tastefully furnished, lived in, with framed photographs on a side table that stopped my breath for a moment. Kunle at what looked like a birthday celebration, Kunle laughing at some private joke, Kunle looking in every single frame more relaxed and unguarded than I could remember him looking with me in years. That, more than anything else in that apartment, was the detail that undid me. Not the pregnancy, not the perfume, the plain, undeniable evidence that whatever version of happiness he had once shown me at the beginning of our marriage, he had apparently found his way back to it here, in this other life, while I had been left with the tired, distracted, distant version of him at home. What she told me, standing in that stranger's parlor, was not the story I expected. She was not some scheming young girl who had set out to destroy a marriage for sport. She had met Kunle 4 years earlier, during a period she told me that he had told her he was already separated from his wife, that the marriage existed only on paper because of family pressure, because his mother refused to accept a divorce and threatened to disown him if he left me formally. She said she had believed him for 2 years before she started to suspect otherwise. By then, she was already in love, already tangled into a life with him that included his mother-in-law, Iya Kunle, visiting her regularly, bringing her pepper soup when she caught a cold, calling her my daughter in a way that Iya Kunle had never once called me in 9 years of marriage. I want you to sit with that for a moment, the way I had to sit with it standing in that stranger's parlor. My mother-in-law, who visited my home and drank my zobo and asked me pointed questions about my fertility with a face of polite concern, was visiting another woman's home too, calling her daughter, tending to her the way a woman tends to the wife she actually wanted for her son. Moro told me Iya Kunle had once sat exactly where I was now sitting, on that same cream sofa, helping her choose fabric for a burial outfit when Moro's own mother had passed away 2 years earlier, holding her hand through that grief with a warmth I had waited 9 years to receive and never once been given. She used to tell me to be patient, Moro said, her voice catching slightly as she spoke, one hand still resting protectively over her stomach. She kept saying, "It will resolve itself soon. Just hold on a little longer. These things take time." I believed her because she is his mother. Who lies to a woman about her own son's marriage if it isn't already ending? I did not have an answer for her because I was asking myself the exact same question, except from the opposite side of the same lie. Moro told me something else that afternoon that cracked the story open into a shape I had not anticipated. She said that Iya Kunle had known her family for over a decade, that Moro's late father and Iya Kunle had been childhood friends in the same village outside Osogbo, and that there had been an old, informal understanding, the kind families sometimes make and never quite let go of, that Moro and Kunle would one day marry each other. When I came along, a woman with no connection to that village, no family history intertwined with Iya Kunle's own, a woman Kunle had chosen entirely on his own terms at a wedding in Ibadan, I had, without ever knowing it, become an obstacle to a plan that predated our entire marriage. Moro told me more that afternoon than I think she had ever planned to tell me, perhaps because carrying the weight of that secret alone for so long had become its own kind of exhausting. She said that in the early years, before I existed in either of their lives, Iya Kunle's mother had actively encouraged the closeness between him and Moro, inviting Moro's family to festive gatherings, seating the two of them beside each other at every family event, speaking openly in front of relatives about when rather than if they would eventually marry. When Kunle came to university in Ibadan, met new friends, built a new circle, and slowly drifted from the arrangement his mother had quietly been cultivating since childhood. When he brought me home instead, years later, Iya Kunle smiled through the introductions, danced at our wedding, and never once in 9 years let go of the conviction that a mistake had been made, a mistake she considered it her duty eventually to correct. This is the part of the story I did not expect, and it is the part I most want you to understand, because it means the true architect of my suffering was never really Moro at all. Moro was in her own way another woman caught in something larger than herself, fed lies about the state of my marriage by a man skilled at telling each woman exactly what she needed to hear. The true architect was Iya Kunle, who had spent 9 years being polite to my face while quietly nurturing an alternative future for her son, feeding Kunle's guilt over my miscarriage as an opportunity rather than a tragedy. Encouraging, Moro told me this directly, her voice shaking as she said it, encouraging Kunle to give himself the chance for children with someone whose body was not cursed, a phrase Iya Kunle had apparently used more than once about me in front of his son.
I left that apartment in a kind of daze that had nothing to do with my still healing surgical scar. I want to be honest with you. I did not hate Moro by the end of that conversation, not entirely. I understood her better than I wanted to. She had been lied to as thoroughly as I had, just from a different angle, and she was carrying a child who had done nothing to deserve being born into this mess. My anger, when it finally found its proper target, aimed itself at two people: my husband, who had built an elaborate double life on a foundation of lies told to two women at once, and his mother, who spent 9 years smiling at me while working patiently and deliberately toward my erasure. I confronted Kunle that same evening when he came home from work expecting, as he always did, a quiet house and a wife too worn down by grief and suspicion to challenge him directly. I laid it all out on our dining table: the receipt, the printed messages, the photograph of Moro and her growing stomach, and finally, the detail that made his face actually change color for the first time in this entire ordeal: what Moro had told me about his mother. He tried denial first, the way liars always do, insisting Moro was confused, exaggerating, bitter about something unrelated. But when I told him I intended to call his mother right there, in front of him, and ask her directly whether she had visited Moro's apartment, whether she had called her my daughter, whether she had said the words about a cursed body, his composure finally broke. Not into honesty, not fully, but into the particular panic of a man who realizes the story he has been managing for years has slipped out of his control all at once. We agreed, or rather, I insisted, and he was in no position to refuse, that his mother would come to our house that weekend, and that Moro, whom I invited myself over Kunle's frantic objections, would come too. He tried for 2 full days to talk me out of inviting her, insisting it would be unnecessary drama, that whatever needed to be resolved could be resolved between the two of us. I understood, watching him scramble, that his objection had very little to do with sparing me discomfort and everything to do with controlling how much of the full truth would ever reach a single room at once. That, more than anything, was what convinced me I was right to insist. I wanted every person who shaped this deception to be in the same room, saying the truth out loud, when none of them could quietly rewrite it later, when no one could tell one version of events to me privately and a different version to someone else. If you have ever needed the truth to be witnessed, not just known, you understand why I insisted on this. Some lies only truly die when they are spoken aloud in front of everyone they were told to. I spent the days leading up to that Saturday almost eerily calm, the calm of a woman who has already done her crying in private and has nothing left to prove to anyone in that room except the plain facts sitting in the folder I had assembled. Printed messages, the receipt, the photograph, dates, timestamps, everything laid out the way I once laid out lesson plans for difficult classes, methodical, unshakable, impossible to argue around. That Saturday afternoon was one of the hardest of my life, and I have already told you about a night I nearly died. Iya Kunle arrived first, dressed impeccably as always, and her face when she saw Moro already seated in my parlor told me everything I needed to know before a single word was spoken. There was no shock in her expression, only the brief, cornered flicker of someone whose careful architecture has just been exposed to daylight. She tried at first to deny knowing Moro at all, which was almost laughable given that Moro calmly recounted, in specific and painful detail, the pepper soup, the visits, the phrase about a cursed body, the promises of an eventual, blessed union once the paperwork wife, that is what Iya Kunle had apparently called Moro in private more than once, was no longer in the picture. Kunle sat through most of it in silence, his hands folded on his knees like a schoolboy waiting to be dismissed, occasionally muttering weak protests that nobody, including his own mother, bothered to properly answer. I watched him shrink over the course of that conversation, from the confident man who had once made me laugh over jollof rice at a stranger's wedding, into someone smaller, someone who had built his entire adult life on the comfortable assumption that his lies would never all collide in the same room at once. I asked Kunle directly, in front of both women, how long he had known about his mother's role in all of it, whether he had simply been a passive beneficiary of her scheming or an active participant who understood from the very beginning exactly what game he was playing with two women's hearts at once. He would not meet my eyes when he answered. He said quietly, I didn't ask her to do any of it, which was, I noted even in that moment, not actually a denial of knowledge, only a disavowal of responsibility, the oldest trick of guilty men everywhere, admitting the fact while rejecting the blame. Moro, to her credit, did not let him off that easily either. You told me she was your wife on paper only, she said, her voice rising for the first time that afternoon, sharp with anger that had clearly been building far longer than that single conversation. Kunle had no answer for her either, and in the silence that followed, I watched something in Iya Kunle's expression tighten, as though even she had not fully anticipated how badly her son's cowardice would reflect back on her own carefully maintained image as merely a well-meaning mother. There was no dramatic scene of shouting, no plate thrown, no theatrical collapse, though I will admit some part of me had almost wanted that, had almost wanted the catharsis of a scene loud enough to match what I felt inside. Instead, there was something quieter, and in its own way more devastating. The slow, undeniable unveiling of 9 years I had lived believing I understood my own life, only to discover I was a supporting character in someone else's long-running plan. Iya Kunle, when she finally spoke for herself rather than being spoken about, did not apologize. She sat very straight in my parlor chair, the same chair she had sat in countless times before, sipping zobo and asking me pointed questions with a face of borrowed concern, and she said, with a straightness that still chills me when I remember it, that she had only ever wanted what was best for her son, that a woman who could not easily carry children was not, in her words, a full wife, and that everything she had done out of love for Kunle, not malice toward me. when I asked her directly whether she had ever, even once, considered what her scheming would do to me. The years I had spent blaming my own body, seeking out specialists, praying at dawn crusades, quietly grieving each month that brought no news. She waved the question away with a small dismissive gesture of her hand, as though I had asked something irrelevant to the matter at hand. "These things happen. Life is life," she said. I do not think she understood, even in that moment, how much cruelty was folded inside that explanation. Some people mistake their own certainty for righteousness, and I do not believe to this day that she has ever truly reckoned with what she did. What struck me most, sitting across from her in that final confrontation, was not her lack of remorse. I had, by then, stopped expecting any, but the sheer methodical patience the whole scheme had required. 9 years. 9 years of visits and zobo and pointed questions. 9 years of quietly tending a second household while smiling at me in mine. 9 years of waiting for a mistake she considered correctable to correct itself. I have met unkind people before. I had never until that afternoon sat across from someone capable of that particular slow-burning kind of patience in service of unkindness. I want to be honest about how the story ends, because you deserve better than a tidy bow tied over a mess this real. I did not stay. I could not stay in a marriage where the mother-in-law who poured my zobo had spent years quietly working to replace me, where the husband who once made a stranger laugh at a wedding had built an entire second existence out of convenient lies, where the child growing in another woman's body had been made possible partly by my own husband's willingness to let me believe, month after painful month, that the problem causing our childlessness was located entirely in my own body, when in truth he had simply stopped choosing me long before he ever said so out loud. I moved in with my sister Yetunde for the first few months after that Saturday. Sleeping in her spare room, surrounded by boxes I had not yet found the strength to properly unpack, learning slowly how to reassemble a life out of pieces I had not chosen to have scattered. Those early weeks were not graceful. There were nights I cried so hard my chest ached worse than my surgical scar ever had. Nights I found myself humiliatingly reaching for my phone to call Kunle, before remembering, freshly each time, why I no longer could. Grief for a marriage that has died through betrayal is a strange, cruel grief, because you are not just mourning the man, you are mourning every version of the future you had already quietly built inside your head. The children who might have come, the anniversaries you had already started imagining, the small, ordinary Tuesday evenings you had assumed without ever examining the assumption you would always have. But slowly, carefully, I began building something that belonged only to me. My small event decoration business, which I had always run as a side thing, something extra, something for pocket money while my real life was happening around Kunle's career, became something I poured myself fully into, without apology, without asking anyone's permission first. I took on clients I had previously turned away for lack of time. I invested in proper equipment instead of borrowing from other vendors. I hired my first 2 young women recently out of school and found, to my own surprise, a genuine joy in teaching them, in building something that would outlast whatever else life decided to take from me. Within a year, it had grown past anything I had imagined for it, enough that I no longer needed to think of it as small, enough that I signed the lease on my own small office in Ikeja with a steadiness in my hand that would have astonished the woman I was on that hospital bed, waiting for calls that never came. Kunle, I later heard, did marry Moro eventually, in a quiet ceremony his mother did not attend, because Iya Kunle, in a twist that even I found bitterly ironic, decided she did not approve of the way the whole affair had become public knowledge, as though the scandal of exposure was the true sin, rather than the years of deception that had caused it. There is something almost darkly comic in that if you think about it long enough. A woman who spent 9 years quietly orchestrating her son's second family, only to disown her involvement the moment the family she'd engineered stopped being convenient for her own reputation.
I heard through mutual friends who still occasionally passed along news I no longer asked for that Iya Kunle and Kunle barely speak now, their relationship reduced to obligatory phone calls on major holidays, a quiet, unspoken punishment that I suspect wounds her more than any confrontation I could have staged myself. Moro had her child, a daughter, and from what I understand, life between her and Kunle has not been the easy, blessed union her mother once promised. Trust, once you have watched a man build it out of lies for someone else, is not so easily rebuilt for yourself. Moro, I am told, checks his phone now the way I never used to. She asks where he has been the way I learned too late that I should have asked years earlier. I take no pleasure in that. I only note it because it is true and because it confirms something I had already come to believe. A foundation built on betraying one woman does not magically become solid ground for the next one. A man who learns to lie fluently enough to sustain 2 households for years does not simply forget how to lie the moment he settles in a single one. As for me, I did not remarry quickly and I am in no hurry even now. What I gained in the wreckage of that marriage was something I had not expected to find. A clearer sense of my own worth, separate from any man's approval of it, separate from any mother-in-law's judgment of what my body could or could not do. There is a particular kind of freedom that comes from surviving the exact thing you once feared would destroy you, and I did not understand that freedom until I was standing on the other side of it, my business thriving, my sister and friends around me, my own name, not Kunle's wife, not the paperwork wife his mother had reduced me to in private, finally, fully mine again. I still think sometimes about that night in the emergency room, about the 11 unanswered calls, about the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people trying to save you, while the one person who should have been there was somewhere else entirely, choosing someone else entirely. I do not think about it with the same rawness anymore. I think about it now the way you think about a storm you survived, with respect for how close it came to taking everything, and with a quiet, hard-won gratitude that you are still standing to tell the story of it. I learned that the people who are supposed to protect you are not always who you think they are, and that the truth, however long it hides, eventually finds its way into the light, usually in the room you least expect it. If there is one thing I want you to carry away from my story, it is this. Trust your body when it tells you something is wrong, and trust your instincts when they tell you the same thing about the people around you. I ignored both for years, and it nearly cost my life twice over, once on an operating table, and once more slowly in a marriage that had already ended, long before I found the courage to admit it out loud. If my story moved something in you tonight, stay close, subscribe, and walk with me into the next one, because I promise you, there are more truths waiting to be told, and more women like me who found their way back to themselves after everything fell apart.